Hello everyone, my name is Lacie Sutherland and I am a reference librarian here at the Juliet Hampton Morgan Memorial Public Library in Montgomery, Alabama. So for this word of mouth that we are recording today, we're going to be reading a book called Tecumsech and the Prophet, the Shawnee Brothers Who Defied a Nation by Peter Cousins. And I chose this book for this word of mouth because we all know that America's 250th anniversary is next month. It's coming up, and so I chose to read a book about our indigenous population and the history around how our country formed before we became the United States. So I'm going to skip the preface and the prologue. I'm going to start page 1 of chapter 1. The Great Awakening. Tecumseh's father had never lived in the land for which he fought and died, nor had any Shawnee resided in the Kentucky country for nearly 2 decades prior to the Battle of Point Pleasant. Tippecanoe, please forgive me if I mispronounce names, also had been a relative newcomer to the Ohio Valley village he had come to call home. The young war leader of a peripatetic Shawnee band, he grew to manhood in the heart of the Creek Indian Confederacy, 600 miles to the south in what is today central Alabama. That's here. By 1759, however, the time seemed propitious for a move. White settlers were pressing the Creek country from the east. The Tippecanoe's followers found the prospect of Shawnee unity captivating. Tippecanoe went reluctantly, however. His first wife, since deceased, had been Creek, and he had adopted something of their ways. Motuataski, his second bride, belonged to a respected Shawnee family with ties to the Ohio bands, and she was anxious to head north. The southern Shawnees trekked hopefully toward the Ohio River Valley. So did the handful of Shawnees who lived in western Pennsylvania. All thought themselves headed for their ancestral homeland, presumably a country of peace and tribal unity beyond the reach of whites. Their destination, however, was the fault line between French and British interests, and as such was fated to become an imperial battleground. The British had encouraged the Shawnees to assemble in the Ohio Valley, to come home again, that you may become once more a people and not dispersed through the world. English agents claimed the French have deceived you and scattered you about the woods, that they might have it in their power to keep you poor, as the brunt of mockery by other Algonquins, who derided them as a people with nowhere a fire burning. The Shawnees found that the British beacons reinforced their own desire to return home. Then the fire engulfed them. Hoping to avoid entanglements with the whites, the Shawnees instead contributed to the onset of war when they persuaded their Miami Indian allies to settle near them and invite reputable Pennsylvania merchants to compete with French traders. The proposal made sense to the Miamis. The Ohio Valley had once been theirs too, but France saw the Miamis and Shawnees as dangerous British surrogates who threatened its trade route between French Canada and Louisiana. Descending on the Ohio Valley from the Great Lakes, the French and their Indian allies built a fort at the site of modern Pittsburgh, and in November 1755 slaughtered a large British force under General Edward Braddock, sent to expel them. Siding with the now dominant French, Shawnee warriors ravaged the Pennsylvania and Virginia frontiers. Slaughtering hundreds of settlers, they made the name Shawnee synonymous with unbridled savagery. A French officer, horrified at their apparent cruelty, lamented that the Shawnees had become the instrument of hatred between two powerful rivals, as also that of their own destruction, which nearly occurred. When the British conquered Canada and defeated the French in 1763, Algonquin tribes, like the Shawnees, paid dearly for their French alliance. The Indians had hoped that the victorious British would abandon their frontier forts and, like the French before them, become a benevolent father who lavished presents on his red children. Unfortunately for the Indians, the recently ended European Seven Years' War had depleted the British treasury, and the crown economized at their expense. The gifts of gunpowder and lead on which the Indians had come to depend for the hunt ceased. Let the natives revert to bows and arrows, the British reasoned. The Indians, however, wanted the best of both worlds, European goods with no whites in their country except traders. No sooner had the British imposed their austerity regime than a smallpox epidemic devastated Shawnee and Miami villages. Tippecanoe and his family escaped unscathed, but scores succumbed. Compounding the Indians' despair, the British demanded they release hundreds of white captives, few of whom wanted to repatriate. Adoptive families were ripped apart. Meanwhile, as loved ones departed, unwanted whites intruded, a two-way traffic the British did not intend. Ignoring the Crown prohibition, hundreds of rural poor crossed the Alleghenies to scratch out crude homes along the upper reaches of the Ohio River. As English missionary characterized the incoming frontier rabble as white savages who subsist by hunting, an assessment with which the British military agreed. Lamentably dissolute in their morals, these otherwise impoverished rascals had an abundant hatred of Indians and an ample supply of rum, with which they plied the Indians to rob them of their furs. Chiefs protested to no avail, and the corrosive effect of liquor rendered their warriors restive. The turmoil spared the eastern Ohio country, where the Delaware grandfathers of the Shawnees resided. There nevertheless lurked dangers and evil portents enough to set some Delawares to pondering. None contemplated the Delaware destiny more profoundly than did an enigmatic mystic named Neolin, who feared the white man's diseases, abhorred the arrogant British officials who treated the Indians as infants, and understood that colonists wanted Indian land. Perhaps, he speculated, in straying from traditional ways, the Indians themselves were to blame for their misfortunes. One night, alone by his wigwam fire, Neolin beheld a man materialize from the flames to tell him that these things he was thinking were right. The spectral visitor escorted Neolin to the gates of eternity, where the Great Spirit revealed to Neolin the path to righteousness. From that night forward, Neolin was a prophet, or an impostor, depending on the source. Clutching a hieroglyphic painted deerskin and weeping ceaselessly, he roamed his village exhorting passers-by to hear and see the Great Spirit's teachings. Neolin offered a selective return to the old ways interwoven with promises of heavenly rewards for the faithful and damnation for skeptics. Heaven, the Delaware prophet assured his disciples, contained only Indians. Within months his doctrine spread from the Ohio Valley to the Great Lakes. By early 1763, every Algonquin tribe had its devotees, awakened to a religious and cultural movement that superseded tribal and village loyalties. Neolin taught that Indians must abandon their sacred medicine bags, which were the playthings of evil spirits, and instead pray directly to the Great Spirit, better known to the Shawnees as the Master of Life. They must forswear rum and purify themselves by drinking and vomiting in herbal tea. The Shawnees drank and spewed the concoction with such enthusiasm that their village of Wakatomica became known to white traders as Vomit Town. Regurgitating herbs was one thing, but few Indians took seriously Neolin's admonition to abstain from sexual intercourse far more frequently than the Indian belief and the competing sources of male and female power dictated, nor his insistence that fire made with steel and flint was impure. Flames, he said, should be started only by rubbing sticks together. Easier to accept because it entailed no immediate sacrifice was Neolin's call for the gradual abandonment of European trade goods and firearms, a 7-year transition from guns to bows and arrows. The Indians would need their muskets in the near term because Neolin also preached a call to arms against the whites, prophesying that there would be 2 or 3 good talks and then war. The whites would be wiped from the continent, game animals would return in abundance, earth would become an Indian paradise, and the direct route to heaven would reopen. With Neolin's appeal, Pan-Indianism was born in the Old Northwest. In April 1763, near the British fort at Detroit, the Ottawa war chief Pontiac imparted a watered-down version of Neolin's moral code to a council of Indian allies. Indians could drink rum, Pontiac assured his listeners, just not to excess, and men might enjoy sexual relations, but only with their wife, and with one wife only. Finally, it was just the British colonists who were enemies to the Indians. The Great Spirit looked favorably upon the French, who, after all, had implicitly offered to support war against the British. Translating Neolin's call to arms into action, Pontiac laid siege to Fort Detroit. He sent black wampum belts, symbols of the call to war, to the tribes of the Ohio Valley. One British post after another fell until only 3 remained. It was a conflict of unbridled violence. Drunken Ottawas tortured and realistically ate captives. Renegade colonists slaughtered innocent Indians. The Shawnee chief Cornstalk took a huge war party deep into western Virginia, killing and seizing civilians with abandon. Nearly 2,000 British soldiers and colonial civilians perished in the opening months of Pontiac's war, but Forts Detroit, Niagara, and Pitt held out, and the Crown rushed in reinforcements. A stalemate ensured that neither side could break. Unable to defeat Pontiac, the British elevated him to the status of chief of all Algonquins, an office anathema to every Indian except Pontiac. In 1766 he made peace with the British. The war sputtered to a close, but Pontiac had forfeited his standing among the Indians. He went into exile deep in the Illinois country, and 3 years later an irate warrior murdered him on the fetid streets of a small French trading village. In accepting the British proffer of supreme leadership of the still fiercely independent Algonquins, Pontiac had reached too high. Tales of Neolin and Pontiac, of the prophecies of the Delaware seer, and the martial talents of his Ottawa disciple would be told around Indian campfires for years to come. They were heroes for boys to venerate, perhaps eventually to emulate. Besides prideful stories, the Shawnees gained nothing from Pontiac's war. The British compelled them to surrender adopted white members of the tribe, and the reinvigorated Iroquois, who had sided with the British, demanded the Shawnees abandon their claim to hunting ground south of the Ohio River, comprising most of the present-day Kentucky and West Virginia. In November 1768, the Iroquois in turn ceded these lands to the British in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The country west and north of the Ohio, which the British lumped under the rubric Indian Territory, was to be inviolate, the Ohio River boundary permanent. Barred from the proceedings, the Shawnees denounced the Fort Stanwix Treaty as barefaced thievery. They ceased to recognize Iroquois leadership, endeavored to build a coalition independent of the Iroquois, and forswore addressing the British as fathers. Shawnee scouting parties patrolled the Kentucky country on the watch for white interlopers. The trespassers came through the Cumberland Gap or down the Ohio River. Hardscrabble farmers in search of better land, fugitives from justice, and the congenitally restless of slack moral fiber, while from the comfort of their Virginia estates, land speculators deployed surveyors to finagle title to the Indian lands. Among the first intruders was an impoverished North Carolinian named Daniel Boone and 6 other poor whites. Crossing the Cumberland Gap in early 1769, they slaughtered the teeming game animals wantonly without encountering a single Indian until December, when a group of Shawnees under an English-speaking war leader named Captain Will burst into the pre-dawn winter bivouac. The time of our sorrow was now arrived, mused Boone. Instead of meting out the expected torture and death, the Shawnees behaved in the friendliest manner, simply confiscating the party's furs with an admonishment never to return. Now, brothers, declared Captain Will, go home and stay there. Don't come here any more, for this is the Indians' hunting ground, and all the animals, skins, and furs are ours. And if you are so foolish as to venture here again, you may be sure the wasps and yellow jackets will sting you severely. The Shawnees had shown remarkable restraint, but they were mistaken if they thought their painted faces, flashing tomahawks, and formidable war clubs would deter Boone and his companions. No sooner had the North Carolinians reached home than they made plans to return. The Iroquois betrayal at Fort Stanwix and the first wave of white immigrants left the Ohio Shawnees to navigate frightening but familiar waters, just become settled in one place only to have it threatened. Tribal councils debated the viability of the Ohio Valley as a permanent home. Many were for pulling up stakes and relocating west of the Mississippi River. Not only were whites threatening the eastern periphery of the Ohio Valley, but the region was also fast repopulating with other Indians, stressing a game supply already depleted by overhunting for the trade in furs and skins. Relative to the British colonial population on the eastern seaboard, Indian numbers in the Ohio Valley were pitifully small, however. At the time of the treaty at Fort Stanwix, several tribes called the region home, but disease and warfare had taken a heavy toll on all of them. The Shawnees, numbering just 1,500, claimed most of the southern half of what is today Ohio. The Delawares, 3,500 in all, occupied eastern Ohio and northern Pennsylvania nearly to the Delaware River. Unlike the Shawnees, they had no interest in Kentucky. Immediately north of the Shawnees were the Wyandots. Remnants of the once mighty Huron Confederacy, they had been reduced by warfare and disease to 1,250 members. Although their numbers were small and they were not Algonquins, their prestige was such that many Algonquins deferred to them on boundary and other intertribal questions. The northwestern border of the Shawnee country touched land claimed by the Ottawas, most of whose 5,000 members resided in what is today western Michigan. West of the Shawnees were the 1,500 Miamis. The Shawnees did not yet have much contact with other tribes of the Great Lakes region. The total Indian population of the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley in 1768 was approximately 60,000. The 13 British colonies numbered nearly 2 million. The odds against the Indians were bad, and with high birth rates among the whites and unabated immigration to the colonies, they would only get worse. Tecumseh's father, Pocashinois, stood with those Shawnees who were opposed to leaving Ohio, and by 1768 his words carried weight. He had won considerable renown in Pontiac's War, and may have also become the head chief of the Kispokos, one of the 5 tribal divisions. His wife, Methoataske, belonged to the Picowe division. Of these and the other Shawnee divisions, more will be said. Since moving to Ohio, Methoataske had given birth to the couple's first 3 children: a son, Chisikau, born about 1761, a daughter, Tecumsech, likely born the following year, and then another son, Sawasikau. Pawcashinwau probably helped found Kispoko Town, a new satellite Shawnee village well north of the troubled Ohio River border and some 70 miles southeast of modern Dayton. In addition to his honors from Pontiac's War, Pawcashinwau had returned from the conflict with a 4-year-old white boy named Richard Sparks, seized in western Virginia. A young male addition to the family undoubtedly pleased Pawcashinwau and Motataski. Sons were a source of pride, and a white boy taken young enough to raise as an Indian could be counted on to help fill the ranks of Shawnee warriors, which battle losses had cut to no more than 400. Sparks was also roughly the same age as the couple's son, Sawasikau, making them natural playmates once Richard's white identity was expunged. Pawcashinwau grew quite fond of his adopted son. And there's a pause because next page is a map of the area. He renamed the boy Shantute and rejected British demands to repatriate him. Sparks lived among the Shawnees for a dozen years before returning to white society. Later in her life, Sparks's white widow said his adoptive parents raised him with unusual kindness and indulgence. Perhaps that explains why Shantunte resisted leaving Pawcashinwau and Matataski. I remember his telling me how great a calamity he considered it to be taken away from the Indians, recalled his white brother-in-law, and of his schemes for making his escape and returning to them. The fateful year of the Fort Stanwix betrayal, 1768, also brought Pawcashinwau and Matataski a natural addition to their family. Spring found them in Chillicothe, the principal Shawnee town and tribal ceremonial center 45 miles south of modern Columbus, Ohio. Pawcashinwau had come to Chillicothe to attend another of the interminable councils held to discuss the tribe's future. Matataski, meanwhile, awaited the birth of her 4th child. Indian women far along in a pregnancy frequently traveled with their husbands, but they customarily gave birth only in the company of female relatives or friends. As her delivery date drew near, Matataski and her attendants retired to a secluded spot 2 arrow flights southeast of Chillicothe, near the banks of the Secotio River. One night, as Matataski kept to the hut and waited, the other women saw a shooting star sweep across the sky and sink into the western horizon. One passed across, the women excitedly told Matataski. Almost immediately, Tecumseh was born. Such is the story of Tecumseh's birth, as his great-grandson Thomas Wildcat Alford related it. Stephen D. Ruddle, an adopted white boy and youthful confidant of Tecumseh, told a similar tale. In Ruddle's version, which he may have gotten from Tecumseh, it was Matataski herself who witnessed the comment. Both accounts are plausible as to the circumstances, if not the location, of Tecumseh's birth. They also convey something of the significance of Tecumseh's name, the meaning of which can only be rendered imperfectly in English. Even the pronunciation is elusive. Ruddle, who spoke both English and Shawnee fluently, gave it as Tecumseh, while Matataski and her infant son renamed Cloistered. Pawcashinwau invited 2 elderly relatives or friends to the family's wigwam, calling upon them to perform the sacred naming ceremony on the 10th day after his son's birth. The name-givers were to ponder and pray until they divined 2 names from which the parents might choose. On the morning of the 10th day, Matataska cleaned herself and her infant well, left her hut, and returned to the family wigwam. Her caregivers prepared the naming feast. While the extended family crowded around, the infant received a sponge bath. Then the name-givers declaimed on the logic behind the names they offered, one of which presumably incorporated the shooting star metaphor. They called on the Master of Life, the Shawnee Creator, to protect the baby and exhorted the parents to raise him well. Having heard the name-givers out, Pawcashinwau and Matataski made their choice. The name they chose, Tecumseh, derives from, and I will butcher this, Nila ni Tecumseh, meaning I cross the path or way of a living being. As Tecumseh was born into the panther Umsoma patrilineal clan or name group, the animal whose path he crossed was a panther. No ordinary panther, but rather a miraculous creature of transcendental existence that lived in the water but periodically burst across the skies as a shooting star. The panther, celestial or commonplace, was a formidable creature in the 18th century Ohio Valley. A Shawnee male whose name incorporated that of the panther inspired awe because the panther's hunting skills were an object of envy. Shawnee males of the Panther clan conceived of themselves as panthers, and the birth of a boy of the clan beneath the celestial incarnation of the beast portended immense hunting prowess. The infant Tecumseh viewed the world from a Thackeray or cradleboard scratched securely onto his mother's back. The Shawnees believed the Thackeray helped develop good posture. To steady Tecumseh's head, Methotasca likely added a wooden hoop adorned with shells and silver ornaments. As she performed her daily chores, carrying water, gathering firewood, cooking meals, and planting the spring corn crop, Shawnee women indulged in no postpartum rest. Tecumseh rocked gently on her back. Methotasca attended Tecumseh's earthly needs. Pocashanwa saw to the baby's spiritual warfare. After Tecumseh's umbilical cord fell off, Pocashanwa tucked it into his hunting bag. He carried it with him until autumn, then buried it with the antler of a young buck. The commingling of antler and umbilical cord in the earth, blessed with the proper prayers, would help Tecumseh grow into a mighty hunter. Freed from the cradleboard after a year, Tecumseh became subject to a mild form of discipline. If he misbehaved, the toddler might feel the swat of his stick on his tiny legs or find himself tossed into a shallow stream. Shawnees generally doted on their children, however, and he would quickly discover that his parents preferred to praise good conduct rather than punish bad behavior. He would also learn to respect the elderly, whose authority over children was absolute. No sooner did Tecumseh learn to walk than he was one with nature. His feet would have glided over the cool, smooth swept dirt surface of the family wigwam in the spring and summer, and sunk into the soft and warm animal skin rugs that covered the floor in the fall and winter months. The gratifying wintergreen scent of the birch bark walls mingled in his tiny nostrils with the pungent odor of smoke rising from the central hearth. Outdoors he waddled over a carpet of crennet leaves, learning to dodge the catskin and cones that dotted the ground. A symphony of familiar sounds, the idle chatter of women at work, the laughter of lounging warriors, the ceaseless barking and yapping of countless dogs, comforted Shawnee toddlers like Tecumseh. 1,000 aromas rose from the forest floor, wafted on the wind. A night-broken moonlight shivered beneath the canopy of swaying treetops. Inside the wigwam, Tecumseh jostled for a spot among his parents, 3 siblings, adopted white brother, and the inevitable evening visitors. Most Shawnees, he would discover, abhorred solitude. When Tecumseh was 2, Methotasca gave birth to her 5th child, a son named Tahasimo, of whom little was known. Sometime during Tecumseh's childhood, probably when he was 8, smallpox struck Tecumseh. The vomiting, diarrhea, and excruciating headaches eventually passed, leaving in their wake a face slightly pockmarked for life. Then came the bitter autumn of 1774, when Pocashanwa fell fighting the Long Knives at Point Pleasant, and Tecumseh's 14-year-old elder brother Chisika assumed the role of surrogate parent. His sister Tecumseh, who had married the fine young warrior Wisigabo, sometimes spelled Wasabogao, and achieved considerable status herself among the women of the village, helped ease the pregnant Methotasca's burden. Nothing, however, could have prepared Methotasca for her delivery in spring 1775. She gave birth to triplets, a supremely rare occurrence that the Shawnees believed an ill omen and that left Methotasca shaken and ashamed. Her distress was brief, however. One of the infants, a girl, died shortly after birth. The baby boys survived, emerging from their naming ceremonies as Kumsakau, cat that flies, and Laloshiga, a runt whose name meant, perhaps hopefully, panther with a handsome tail. In addition to Chesikau and Tecumseh's contributions, Blackfish, a good-natured war chief of the Chillicothe division who had been a devoted friend of Pocashanwa, did what he could as a foster father to Methotasca's younger children. Lord Dunmore's war had officially ended with the Battle of Point Pleasant. Chief Cornstalk finally recognized the Ohio River boundary line as it had been fixed in the Fort Stanwix Treaty. Some Shawnees advocated peaceful coexistence. Others distanced themselves from the Long Knives. Several hundred Shawnees, representing the entire Thawedikila division, resettled among the Creeks, and the residents of Chillicothe town, 170 families that included those of Middletoski and Blackfish, were moved from the Tecumsech to the Little Miami River in southwestern Ohio. There was no stating the British appetite for Indian land. A memorandum to the British Secretary of War for North America urged His Majesty's government to abrogate any agreement to abstain from exploring the Ohio Valley because the lands were excellent, the climate temperate, and the country is well watered by several navigable rivers communicating with each other. Large boats were able to negotiate the Ohio River itself year-round, making it cheaper to export goods to British West Florida and the West Indies by river, first along the Ohio, then down the Mississippi, then by sea from North New York or Philadelphia. No wonder, then, that wealthy land speculators did a lucrative business buying up large tracts, while the less fortunate poured into the newly opened Kentucky country to grab small parcels concentrated around community forts called stations. The more daring ventured north of the Ohio River. The deepening encroachments distressed a missionary among the Delawares. And here again a pause, but there is another map. The whole country on the Ohio River has already drawn the attention of many persons from the neighboring colonies, he wrote. Generally forming themselves into parties, they would rove through the country in search of land, and some, careless over their conduct or destitute of both honor and humanity, would join a rabble, a class of people generally met with on the frontier, who maintained that to kill an Indian was the same as killing a bear or a buffalo, and would fire on Indians that came across them by the way. By 1775, only Indians stood before the rabble. Unrest in the American colonies had erupted into armed conflict, forcing Great Britain to withdraw its troops from all the Indian country forts except Detroit and Niagara. The colonial empire was vanishing. Or Niagara. Oh, I'm sorry. I mispronounced it the whole time. Niagara. The Shawnees were uncertain what to make of the new peace emissaries who called themselves Americans. We are often inclined to believe there is no resting place for us, and that your intentions are to deprive us entirely of our whole country, Shawnee chiefs told a Virginia delegation in 1775. That summer, a Continental Congress emissary found the Shawnees constantly counseling the women very uneasy in expectation that there would be war. Shawnee tribal councils grew bitter. Representatives of the Tippecanoe and MCCPL councils grew divisions spoke for accommodation. The Chillicothe, among whom Middletoski's family lived, and Tippecanoe divisions for war. Cornstalk did his utmost to avoid conflict with the Americans. In October 1775, he led a Shawnee delegation to Fort Pitt, on the site of Pittsburgh. In exchange for American recognition of the Ohio River as the boundary between Indian and white lands, Cornstalk and his fellow delegates signed a peace treaty that the fledgling American government would be hard-pressed to enforce. For the next 2 years, Cornstalk maintained Shawnee neutrality in the American Revolution. As American pressure on the Shawnee border grew, however, the venerable chief slowly lost his hold over all the Shawnees but the MCCPLs. While Cornstalk and his people arranged to quit the rolling frontier and withdraw north toward Lake Erie, younger Chillicothe and Tippecanoe leaders held their ground and accepted a British call to war against the Americans. Together with the always restive Mingroes, small Chillicothe and Tippecanoe war parties pricked at the frontier defenses. In November 1777, Cornstalk returned to Fort Pitt to renew his pledge of friendship and to warn of militant Shawnee designs. It was a pointless mission. The Americans had grown distrustful of all Shawnees, and Cornstalk's words fell on deaf ears. Growing morose, he reflected, "When I was young and went to war, I thought that each expedition might prove the last, and I would return no more. Now I am here amongst you. You may kill me if you please. I can die, but at once it is all one to me, now or another time." The council terminated, and the officers dispersed. Suddenly, a party of enraged militiamen carrying a comrade's scalped corpse burst into the Cornstalk's room, crying, "Let us kill the Indians in the fort." Cornstalk declared calmly, "If any long knife has anything against me, let him now avenge himself." In response, a volley of 8 bullets riddled his body. "If we had anything to expect from the Shawnees," rued the American commander, "it is now vanished." Tecumseh was 9 when Chief Cornstalk was murdered. He lived in the new Chillicothe town on the Little Miami River, a lovely and seemingly safe location. Wigwams interspersed with log cabins blanketed a high ridge along the river's east bank. Just northeast of the town center stood the council house, 60 feet square and built of strong, notched hickory logs. Corn, melon, and squash fields stretched far away to the south. Vegetables grew abundantly in the rich, dark soil. The Little Miami teemed with fish. The wooded hills of southwestern Ohio abounded in game animals. 12 miles northeast of the new Chillicothe lay the smaller Shawnee community of Piqua, Mud and Springfield, Ohio. Tecumseh was a busy youngster. Strenuous exercise consumed his days. Running, swimming, and jumping were matters of course with us, recalled a Shawnee, but the older men encouraged us to practice those things that developed greater strength. Also, they taught us to shoot our bows and arrows with accuracy and great skill. Tecumseh would have had a scaled-down bow and small arrows, large enough to shoot small animals or to play the hoop game, in which boys tried to send arrows through a rolling grapevine hoop, but not so large as to be a danger to him. Adult males tested Tecumseh on his marksmanship and his endurance. When a boy got up in the morning his face was black with charcoal, and he was sent out to kill some game for food, Tecumseh's great-grandson wrote of the woodland practicum. It might be a quail, a rabbit, or a squirrel, seldom large enough game than that. He was given no food until he returned with what he was sent out to procure. Because his face was blackened, everyone who saw him knew why he was out, and no one gave him food or helped him in any way. He was absolutely on his own resources. Hunting came naturally to Tecumseh. He always killed more birds than any of his party, recalled the métis mixed blood, Anthony Shane, who later married a cousin of Tecumseh. Shane said that Tecumseh had his own little gang over which he exercised implicit control. The Shawnees expected nothing less from the son of a renowned war chief, watched over by a celestial panther guardian. Emulating the animal's nobler qualities would naturally have become the adolescent Tecumseh's most ardent desire. Like the panther, he longed to be a strong and stealthy beast of prey, capable of catching deer at will. He learned that the panthers who stalked the forest surrounding Chillicothe never harmed humans without provocation. Neither would Tecumseh. Should an Indian draw too near the den of a female panther with cubs, however, he faced mortal danger. Surviving such an encounter required absolute self-possession. Tecumseh learned never to turn his back on a she-panther, thinking he could escape. He must stare the animal down. If he lacked the courage to shoot, he must gently but firmly walk backward until he was a safe distance away. If he shot and missed, he would almost certainly forfeit his life. Tecumseh was careful not to play with girls. Shawnee boys who did so were doomed to merciless ridicule. From the time a boy could walk, he was taught to feel superior to his sisters. Nevertheless, Tecumseh worshipped the 15-year-old Tecumseh, the adolescent she-panther of the family, whenever Matotaski faltered, and little girls lavished affection on him. Shane said Tecumseh told the other boys that he would never tie himself to just one girl, because all the pretty girls wanted him. As with childhood female attention, Tecumseh seldom wanted for nourishing food. He enjoyed a varied diet. Whites who ate Shawnee dishes usually enjoyed them too. Favorites included venison roasted over open coals with herbs and dipped in bear oil, beaver tails, duck, or squirrels wrapped in wet corn husks and baked in hot ashes, and dried pumpkin and venison cakes. Some whites objected to the absence of salt. The Shawnees also liked salt, but it was hard to come by. Obtained from naturally occurring salt springs or licks, it required much boiling to extract even a pinch, so the Shawnees made do with herbs, a healthy alternative. As for sweets, the Shawnees favored molasses sugar, but also enjoyed chocolate acquired from traders. Corn was a dietary staple venerated as a divine gift to be harvested joyfully. The dishes made from corn ranged from a wholesome cornbread mixed with fruit to emergency hunting rations in the form of parched corn cakes. When not visited by white men's diseases, the Shawnees were a healthy people who took great pride in their physical appearance. Their standards of hygiene were higher than those of white frontiersmen, which were frankly abysmal. A white captive boy remembered that his Shawnee father bathed regularly year-round, plunging nude into frigid rivers in the dead of winter. Shawnee men thought facial and body hair unattractive and plucked it with mussel shells. Of at least medium height, slender and well-built, their skin tone varied from a light olive to a dark brown, and their eyes were generally brown. The Shawnees had jet-black hair when young, which grayed normally with age. European trade goods comprised much of the clothing and adornment of the woodland tribes. In cold weather, Shawnee men, and sometimes women, wore a cloak called a match coat, formerly made of deer, panther, or bearskin, and worn with the fur facing inward. By the late 18th century, Indian match coats were of course woolen cloth called strawed, usually about 7 feet long, which were wrapped around the upper part of the body like a toga. Match coats also served in pinch as blankets. Eventually, ready-made European garments replaced them in the Shawnee wardrobe. In warm weather, men dressed in a linen shirt, a beach clout, which was a long rectangular piece of tanned deerskin, cloth, or animal fur worn between the legs and tucked under a belt, so that the flaps covered the genitals, animal skin leggings, and deerskin moccasins. Some also donned hats bought from traders or wrapped handkerchiefs around their heads. Male hairstyles also reflected a European influence. Traditionally, men had shaved their heads bald to the crown, leaving only a circular handful that they adorned with a feather plume or colorful hair ruche. Increasingly, however, warriors wore their hair long, braided and adorned with ostrich feathers. Tattoos, never frequent among Indians north of the Ohio River to begin with, were seldom seen in Tecumseh's day. Only war paint, fashioned from iron oxide and most commonly worn as red, black, or white stripes, remained unchanged. Shawnee traditionalists found the wearing of long hair and linen shirts by men off-putting. Women's wear, on the other hand, drew general approval, even of traditionalist males. Most adult females wore calico blouses that closed at the breast with a silver brooch and extended about 6 inches below the waist, a skirt of stroud terminating just below the knee, and leggings. They greased their hip-length hair with bear fat until it sheened and then braided it. Some women daubed red dots on their cheeks, but most used no facial paint. The colorful apparel and ornamentation of Shawnee females fascinated one captive white adolescent. Elderly women dress simply, but all of the young and middle-aged are passionately fond of finery, having the tops of their moccasins curiously wrought with bead ribbons and porcupine quills, the borders of their leggings and the bottom and edges of their strouds tastefully bound with ribbons edged with beads, and frequently on their moccasins and leggings small tufts of deer's hair, dyed red and confined in small pieces of twine, rattling as they walked, he recalled. Jewelry was ubiquitous. According to their ability, they covered themselves with large and small silver brooches and wore on their wrists and arms silver bracelets from 1 to 4 inches in width. Both sexes coveted silver baubles, the more the better. Indeed, men were more ostentatious than women. Not only did they wear silver bracelets and nose rings, they also customarily cut their ears, binding the auricle with brass wire, from which dangled silver pieces nearly to their shoulders. The white men, unaccustomed to the sight, a fully decked-out woodland Indian presented an aspect variously described as colorful, bizarre, or grotesque. In these striking surroundings, the young Tecumseh passed his evenings absorbed in stories told by male elders. Like other Shawnee boys, he learned the premium their people placed on oratory skill. Tales of the first encounter between Shawnees and whites held boys spellbound with wonder and dread. A Makoche chief related one such story. Our old men used to tell our people that a great serpent would come from the seas and destroy our people. When the first European vessel came in sight, the Indians saw the pennant with its forked end darting and moving like the forked tongue of a serpent. There, said they, is the serpent our old men have been telling us about. When the old men first tasted rum, tears ran down their cheeks. This, they said, is what will destroy our young men. Equally fearsome were tales told of witches. As the elder of the two, Tecumseh heard them first, but they would make a deeper impression on his awkward younger brother, Lacie. Not that Tecumseh discounted such talk. Witchcraft cast a malevolent shadow over the Shawnees, who fervently believed that necromancers of both sexes prowled the dark forested periphery of their existence, probing for weaknesses, ever ready to wreak pain and sow chaos. The Shawnees thought that witches derived their power from bits of the living flesh of the great serpent that had impeded the mythological Shawnee migration across the Atlantic Ocean. The fabled Shawnees had lured the beast ashore, where, with mystical rites and minstrel blood, they killed, dismembered, and then burned the creature. But malicious tribesmen had prevented a few scraps of the serpent's reanimated flesh, which they mixed with other vile substances in a medicine bag to obtain necromantic powers. Witches passed the bag secretly to succeeding generations. The Shawnees were not unique among woodland Indians in their strong belief in witchcraft or in its manifestations. Other woodland tribes shared similar views. In their perpetual struggle for eternal harmony, neglect of ritual gave witches free rein to wield their evil against fellow tribesmen, engendering earthly chaos, dissolution, and anguish. Unfortunate for tribal prospects, the Shawnees believed the witches in their midst were powerless against the whites. They could, however, so weaken the Shawnees as to guarantee their subjugation. Practitioners of the black arts were said to possess a physical characteristic, such as a red eye or an abnormal birthmark, that often betrayed them. They worked furtively and usually at night, plying their maleficent trade against neighbors and kinsmen. Envious and spiteful, witches were believed to not be entirely human, which should have made their destruction easier to stomach. As witches were a primal force of disorder and decay, everyone had a duty to eradicate them. By the time Tecumseh learned of witches, many Shawnees speculated that tribal misfortunes stemmed from neglect of the Creator's injunction that they expunge them from their midst. Few Shawnees, however, had the more courage to undertake the task. So that was the end of chapter 1 of the book we have here at the Julie Hampton Morgan Memorial Public Library, Tecumsech and the Prophet, the Shawnee Brothers Who Defied a Nation by Peter Cozzens. You will notice that throughout the book, Cozzens uses the term Indians to refer to our indigenous population of the United States. It is always better to speak directly to the Native American population to ask them, like, what is the preference of term to refer to them. Indigenous, Native American, and Indians are considered acceptable. Cozzens chooses Indians. It's always best, like I said, to speak to the indigenous population themselves to get their preference for a term. Thanks for speaking with us. We want to wish our fellow patrons a happy 250th on July 4th next month. If you're interested in checking out this book, come see us here at the library. Thank you.